welcoming Bill Wohlforth, and we're recording. Thank you.
Judy, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks folks for coming. I hope that people will either use the chat function or somehow wave if somehow I freeze up or something like that, because we've got two people in this household at the moment using the usually reliable Wi-Fi. So thanks so much for that introduction. I look forward to this, although the subject is depressing. It's nice to be able to see fellow Limeys from here in London. I'm currently directing the Government Department's Foreign Study Program, which takes students and brings them to London, and we work with the LSE International Relations Department to put together a really great program here. I am keeping abreast obsessively with events in Russia's war in Ukraine. I am continuing, although it might be controversial, nonetheless, I'm continuing to facilitate meetings between international relations scholars from Russia and those from the United States. And I have had a few off-the-record conversations with American officials regarding their Ukraine policy. But by and large, what I'm going to tell you today is based on public available sources, which I simply follow obsessively. Judy, do we have it's like an hour, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll try.
If we go over a little bit, that's okay. We are recording, but an hour I think is good.
In case people haven't yet gotten out to vote, I'll try to keep things on time. So I'm going to show you a few slides and talk about the current status. It was very interesting reviewing the slides I prepared for the talk I gave to this at this library in March. And that helped inform me sort of what would constitute this update. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And right, sharing. And presumably you should now be seeing some slides. Is that correct?
Yes.
Into nodding. Good. And I will start the show from the start. So this is what I'm going to do. I'll give you a quick update on these three issues. An overall assessment of the status of the situation today, much different than it was back in March. Why we don't see publicly negotiations to end this war. And it is just parenthetically a terrible war. It is simply not the case that we only focus on this war because it involves white people, and somehow we don't care about wars that occur in places where it's not Europeans fighting Europeans or Europeans fighting Russians. In fact, this is probably the worst interstate war we've seen since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s in terms of its devastating toll in human life and in economic property. So it is legitimately a scary situation, a devastating and tragic one that's worthy of our attention, particularly since, as you doubtless have noticed in recent weeks, one of the protagonists, Russia, is a nuclear, really counts as a nuclear superpower with a nuclear arsenal comparable to that of the United States. So in this war, unlike some others, there is a risk potentially, I think it's low at the moment, of escalation to nuclear use. And so there's a reason why we focus on it. I'm going to talk about that assessment, the status of the situation, why there's no negotiations despite those high stakes and high costs that I just mentioned. And finally, reflect a bit on what this war has done to the political system that Putin constructed in Russia. Sort of wars tend to have big effects on countries that wage them. It's having a big effect on Ukraine in some ways. Not all negative, let's face it, a lot of rallying around the flag in very admirable ways in that country. But in Russia, what is it doing to this political economic system that Putin constructed? All right, so without further ado, that's where I'm going. Let me just first talk about the overall assessment of the status. On the left on this title slide, you see the Institute for the Study of War's current, as of yesterday, estimate of the situation on the ground. Many of you who've been following the news will be familiar with maps like this. Gives you a situation, that gives you a sense of the military situation on the ground. Before I get to that, I forgot I put in the slide with Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld is there, not to give you unhappy memories of the early 2000s, but because he famously said you need to distinguish between the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And what I really want to promise to you before I say anything further is that when I give a talk like this, I really try to think about what I'm saying and distinguishing among the three things that I have on this slide. There are things that I know and I can be very confident of, such as the simple fact that we don't see public negotiations between Moscow and Kiev. There are things that could be known. They're knowable, but I just don't know them. And that's, for example, the question of whether there's something going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. But then there are things that you just can't know, because the nature of them is that you can't know them. And an example of that is the probability that Putin gets ousted. You know, the nature of regime change is that the only way it works is if you keep it really, really secret. You know, if you know about it, it won't work. So that's just the thing that by design, I cannot know. And I put this in here because I really want you to know that I'm being careful here and not just bloviating about stuff that I couldn't know, that I don't know or couldn't possibly know. Okay, having said that, let's get to the current situation. Starting with the situation on the ground, which I won't belabor because not everybody's fascinated by military things. You probably, if you've been following the news, know that since certainly since September's very successful Ukrainian offense in the north against the Kharkiv area, that Ukraine has got the military momentum on the conventional battlefield on the ground. And it still has that momentum, although it is slowed. And this slide shows you the situation, the Institute of the Study of War, as seen by that institute in the southeast portion of Ukraine around Kherson Oblast, a region, the Kherson region of Russia and of Ukraine. And there's, you know, currently a lot of talk about the building potential battle for the town of Kherson, which is shown on this map. Sort of, I can't point it to you, but there's kind of a little yellow, blue shading in the center of this map, which is the significant city of Kherson, seized by Russia in the spring, the only major regional capital, that is capital of one of these provinces or regions that Russia actually ever seized. And Russia has been evacuating troops from it. You can see that it lies on the Dnipro River and that it is on that western bank of that river. And currently there is a brutal sort of setup for a battle going on there. Ukraine heavily hitting all the ways that Russia gets to supply its troops in that city. Bridges, pontoon bridges, boats trying to cross the river and move personnel and gear. And the result is they've kind of starved out, they've strangled the supply of that Russian garrison in Kherson. As a result, many people think it's untenable over the long run and that Russia will have to retreat across that river. If it does, that will be seen as a major symbolic setback for Russia. However, the progress of the war right now, though Ukraine still has the initiative, is slow. It's a slogging, tough advance for many, many reasons that I could get into, but quickly, one of them is that Russia has indeed mobilized something like 250 to 300,000 of its citizens. That means this is a conscript army. We have conscripted soldiers fighting. It's taken a portion of those, even though poorly trained, and thrust them into the front, helping to stabilize some areas, allowing them to put up a fiercer resistance. It's a slog because the Russians have been preparing for this for a very long time. It's a slog because the fall brings wet and brings difficult transport. It's a slog for a lot of reasons. So most military experts don't expect some dramatic breakthrough in the south to match that dramatic breakthrough we saw in the north around Kharkiv back in September. So we've got this sort of slogging situation on the ground. We can't know this, but the best estimate, what I can tell you is, I can tell you what military analysts say, rather than I can tell you what the future is. And what military analysts say is that we probably won't see this winter some sort of decisive shift on this battlefield. Likely Russia will be able to sustain its positions. Again, that's a probability estimate based on military experts who spend all of their time trying to understand these things. So we have a slog, we have Ukraine with the momentum, which most of us applaud. But a lot of other things have happened here, and I put them on bullet points. Putin has kind of tied his hands with a couple of political moves that make it harder for him to retreat and withdraw and compromise. The Russian economy is not being as hurt as much as I and many others expected to be hurt when I gave the talk to this series back in March. Russia's international position has definitely taken a big hit, but it is not as isolated as many people I talk to think. I mean, if you read the Western press, we tend to equate the West, that is the US and its close allies, with the world. And the reality is it's actually not that simple. And Russia does have tacit or not a lot of explicit support, but a lot of tacit support in the international arena. And finally, the best estimates of people who study these things is that the US and the West will continue to sustain support for Ukraine through the winter. So let me just quickly walk through these things with these last 4 points of slides and then move on. Tying hands is a term people use in negotiation and bargaining when a bargainer basically does something that makes it much harder to compromise. It's kind of a power move in a way. It's an attempt to intimidate the opponent and to signal to the opponent that you are not inclined to compromise. Putin did this basically several ways. One, by mobilizing all of those troops, by imposing those costs on his own citizens. He's basically making it much harder now to accept anything that couldn't be spun as a victory in this terrible war. In addition, he announced the annexation. I put annexation in scare quotes because he hasn't actually annexed them. As you can see from this map, the Russian militarily occupied portions of Ukraine obviously do not correspond to those territories he has claimed as part of Russia. But you can see here Luhansk in the upper right, Donetsk just below that, Zaporizhia and Kherson, and he's already obviously annexed Crimea. And so all of these parts of Ukraine he now says are inalienably part of Russia. And the process of incorporating him in the Russian Federation is moving apace. Even though he doesn't occupy all of these constitutionally defined territories. So that move really is a tying hands kind of move, making it very hard for him now to turn around to his citizens or his supporters or his fellow members of the ruling elite and say, despite this claim that these are forever citizens of Russia, I'm actually going to make a deal where we don't get some of them. So that has made that has been a move to escalate the Russian commitment to the war, which has been very upsetting and unfortunate from the standpoint of any kind of conflict resolution in the near term. In gambling terms, you call it doubling down on his Ukraine expedition. The Russian economy is not as damaged from the massive tranche of sanctions that we've imposed upon them as we thought. This excellent report, this graphic is from an excellent report in the New York Times, which kind of gets at some of it, which is that restricting Russian exports to some places, particularly their energy exports, is just compensated by greater imports in other places. And you can see that huge export increase to China and to India, as well as Turkey, a NATO ally, and other countries. In addition, what you've done here, in part from Econ 101, is you've restricted the supply of some of these commodities, particularly oil and gas, and then the price of them goes up, which means the net receipts to the Russian treasury stay the same or even increase. So what this means in the short term is that Russia can continue to fund its war. Now, that's not denying that these sanctions are punishing the Russian economy. The Russian economy is contracting at a scary rate that would be scary for most countries. And it's really punishing, the sanctions regime is really punishing Russia's long-term ability to function as a modern, technologically sophisticated state. So Russia's going to have a hard time rebuilding its military, but it's not going to be stopped, from prosecuting this war in the near term. Russia's international position is more complicated and nuanced than we tend to read in most of the press reporting on this conflict. Now, I want to state first and foremost that this is a little bit of a busy and complicated chart, but what it's trying to show you is it's dividing up countries as to how supportive they are or opposed they are to Russia on the Ukraine crisis. And this is done by a bunch of Russian scholars, some of whom I interacted with back in Moscow, and I disagree with some of their coding rules here. What they're trying to do on this chart is show you this sort of control for the size of these countries in population and economy and military spending, and then their number, and then how they sort of have acted in the UN votes and on the sanctions, sort of how supportive versus how opposed. And sort of the good news for the West and the bad news for the Russia is that Russia only has, 4 really unambiguous 100% in the team Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Eritrea. Not the most impressive array of allies. But what is disconcerting from a Western and from a Ukrainian perspective is the very large number of so-called, what they code as sympathetic countries. And those countries are ones that are sort of trying to evade the sanctions, or actually absolutely evading the sanctions, and they are massively increasing Russian imports of Russian goods, et cetera, et cetera. And they are abstaining from key votes in the UN that condemn this invasion. And so Russia can, in some sense, take some comfort, a little bit of cold comfort, I should say, by looking at the large number and importance of countries that might be said to be leaning in Russia's direction, or at least kind of expressing understanding that Russia had legitimate griefs and beefs in this particular war. Moving on to this current status, and again, there's many other things I could discuss, so if you've got questions, I'm really looking forward to them. But the best estimates that most public opinion pollsters and political experts in the key Western countries that are the bulwark of support to Ukraine, best estimate is that this support is likely to survive the winter. Back in the middle of the summer and the early fall, there was fears about this. Of course, we're having a very warm weather here in Europe. So far, it's been astonishing, and that's helped. But the European countries in particular have taken a lot of measures to try to come up with kind of a plan B on their energy supplies to deal with the embargo on Russian exports, or the massive reduction in Russian imports of these goods from Russia. And people I've gone and given some talks in Europe, and you'll notice, people got their thermostats really low. I got to tell you, I was missing my wood stove when I visited Oslo to give a talk. We have like 18, Celsius, kind of a fairly clammy situation. And they seem to be bearing up to it. And when pollsters ask them what they think, they will still express strong support for Ukraine. Everybody who studies this thinks U.S. support is crucial. In other words, if the United States backs out of this thing, you're going to see a cascade of people backing out of support for Ukraine. So that, of course, leads to the question of whether an outcome in today's election could affect the U.S. support. We can talk about later. I personally think there is a movement in a wing of the Republican Party that is more and more critical of U.S. support. But I think the backbone of the Republican Party is still very pro support for Ukraine. I don't expect to see a legislature that would essentially cut off Biden proposed further increases in aid, or further increments of aid to Ukraine. So that's the current situation. It's very different from March, in that we now know a lot of things we didn't know in March. We know that Ukraine is way more militarily capable than we thought it was in March. We know that Russia is very committed. The Putin regime is very committed, willing to pay very high costs, higher costs than people thought might be possible in March. Witness the calling up of reserves, the mobilization. A lot of people debated whether Putin would ever do that. We see a fairly robust Western support. We see more clearly than we did in March the array of countries on the various sides of this global dispute. So we see a lot more information about this conflict, but not enough for us to know where it's headed. And that basically is the answer to my question, the second question I'm posing here, which is why no negotiations? Basically, the reason you don't see negotiations, and again, could there be talks on the back burner, on the backstage? Yes. Could India, Turkey, or other power be carrying messages back and forth between Kiev and Moscow? Totally possible. But the rhetorical positions of each side in public are absolutely nowhere near anything that would lead to optimism about a negotiated settlement to this war. Putin has not given up, on the very least, at all these annexations. And Zelensky has said, I'll never negotiate while Putin is still in power. He might back away from that. Zelensky has said, we want Crimea back. And that's a non-starter for the Russians. We're just nowhere near negotiations, which is tragic because the war is imposing horrific costs on Ukraine and dramatic costs on the rest of the world, especially the global South. So why no negotiations? Why this hardening of positions? Well, it's partly because each side thinks it can win. I mean, basically, each side has a theory of victory, and there's no way to test this theory except by fighting some more. And that's the brutal horror reality of war, is that you can't know an outcome until you test your theory. And I've put on this slide kind of Russia's theory, because I think the Ukraine's theory is pretty clear. Ukraine's theory is we keep funneling weapons in, and Ukrainian bravery, ingenuity, cleverness, esprit de corps, and national feeling and military leadership will ultimately push Russia from their territory. And therefore, they will get all their territory back. That's kind of Ukraine's theory. The US theory, I think, is along the lines of ultimately Russia will be weakened to the point where it will be willing to accept a tiny fraction of what it now claims. Russia's theory of of victory is kind of on this slide. On the left, you're seeing a Russian strike against a Ukrainian power transfer station. And basically the idea is to make life miserable for Ukrainians through hitting power, water, infrastructure. This plan has been in effect, this barrage of inflicting pain upon the people of Ukraine has been going now for 3 weeks or so. The idea being ultimately you're simply going to wear down the Ukrainian people's ability to resist. And in truth, if you look at the costs that are being borne by the two sides, and basically Russia's economy is declining, but it's functioning. Russians are eating, Russians are not displaced, Russians are experiencing some costs. But the people who are experiencing the real costs are Ukrainian people. The costs of that country are astonishing and are difficult to calculate. The numbers on here are estimates. You know, you may have something being able to talk about a decline of GDP, that is to say their economic output verging on half in 2022. We're talking about 15 million people. We're talking about 7 million external, external and 8 million internally displaced persons as best we can estimate. A gigantic number of people, the external ones, mainly women and children, gone from Ukraine out of a population of about 39 million. Just think of the scale of that massive movement and displacement of human beings, upsetting their lives, upsetting their world, their homes, their property, their lives, and massively impacting the social capital and human capital of the society. We don't know how many killed in action or wounded in action there are, because Ukraine is very, very, very secretive about this, but we know there's tens of thousands of them. And we know that's true on the Russian side as well. But again, the Ukrainian population is a third the size of Russians. Property damage is really difficult to estimate, but you've got some estimates on this slide. Very, 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 very painful. So the idea of the Putin theory of victory is we're going to mobilize these troops. We're going to put enough of them in the battle now to prevent Ukraine from any kind of breakthrough. We're going to train up the rest of them. We'll ultimately probably go on the offensive. In the meantime, we'll sustain our positions. We will punish Ukraine so that it's costing a lot to the Ukrainian people and leadership. And by the way, also costing the West a lot, because the West not only is funneling military gear and kit into Ukraine, but it's also essentially funding Ukraine's budget. And that, the theory of victory goes, is going to ultimately tire the West out of supporting Ukraine. And once the West pulls the plug, Ukraine has no way it can basically sustain its fighting. It might have to go to a guerrilla war strategy. So that's basically Putin's theory of victory. Is it crazy? I think it's wrong, but I don't think it's crazy. That is, it's just possible that he could prevail, or at least survive. You can't rule it out. And so the fact that he still can believe that and not be crazy to believe it, and the fact that Ukraine can still believe in its theory of victory, means neither side has an incentive to go to the negotiating table, and neither is willing to accept anything close to what the other has even suggested it could put on the table. So that's the sad reality with the stalled negotiations. Finally, summing up, and there's a lot more that could be said. Obviously, I could threaten you with endless lecture, but won't do that. concluding here on what the war is doing, seems to be doing to what we might call this Putin system, the system that Putin, from the really early 2000s up until the war, was creating and running in Russia. And I've got three changes on this slide. From a kind of spin dictatorship to a full-out 100% dictatorship. From a foreign policy of kind of an intelligence operation, like a clever, sneaky, hybrid, special operation foreign policy, to war. And from the old social contract between the regime and its people, from one in which was tolerating kind of an autonomous, kind of Western-ish civil society in the public, as long as they didn't get political, to a new regime of imposing real sacrifices on Russian people and Russian families. So the government now asking them for these sacrifices. So very quickly walk through these with a few pictures, and then I'll conclude. We really saw this shift from the old Putin regime to the new Putin regime, beginning of the war with this. This is a picture from a Security Council meeting where Putin essentially berated and humiliated his top national security team. It was really a scene that was reminiscent of sort of Saddam or Stalin style kind of political theater. And it gave you a sign that we're moving away from the old days when it was this clever Kremlin manipulation. They could use really slick propaganda. They wouldn't need to show the iron fist of the regime so much, because they could kind of spin things as seeming as if they have public and popular consent, and seeming as if the regime really actually isn't that strong of a dictatorship. In the old days, I used to go to Russia. You had free access to the internet. You had all your Facebook, New York Times, unlike, for example, China, where they have the great wall of China blocking access to aspects of the internet. In Russia, things were very much very seamless coming from the West, and young Russians could live their lives and so on and so forth. And now the toughness of the regime is very much more evident. Its status as a dictatorship is much more transparent. This one is a very notable change in Russian foreign policy, namely, most of what Russia was doing in international relations in terms of foreign policy and diplomacy up until this war was really the Putin specialty. So Putin came out of the KGB. He was an intelligence operative and very proud of it and aware of this identity. And if you looked at foreign policy, it was really this kind of clever, like, use small amounts of force and do things at the margin. So you think about all of the big noteworthy things that happened before this invasion. You had, the 2014 intervention in Crimea, which is exemplified by this picture showing the so-called little green men. These were unidentified Russian soldiers that were sent in, so Putin could deny that they were really Russian members of the Russian armed forces. It was some sort of local thing, and kind of claim that the annexation of Crimea was this sort of upswelling locally. And then he intervened in 2014 in eastern Ukraine, but again, same thing, not really invading, but kind of like sending the troops in secret and not really, kind of denying it implausibly. And then he had his intervention in Syria. Once again, it's kind of like a small operation. It's very controlled. You had his intervention in Libya, where he intervened in that civil war, kind of on the side, kind of clever, kind of doing his thing. Everything. He had the intervention in US elections in 2016 and 2020. By the way, they're still intervening now. So these kind of clever operations. And that special operation approach to foreign policy, basically, in the case of Ukraine, did not work. It didn't get him what he wanted, which was the dominant position in Ukraine and control over his foreign policy. So as a result, he's now moved to foreign policy by actual old-fashioned military war. And that's a momentous change in foreign policy, which is kind of linked to all the other changes that I mentioned, making a real dictatorship, imposing costs on society. And finally, the old social contract that all Russia experts used to talk about, which was, look, people, leave politics alone and we'll leave you alone. You can leave this, be part of the West, be young, dance, have your iPhones, go to your beautiful cafes. You've got your credit cards. You just click on the thing, get your cappuccino, life in Moscow was totally Euro, totally first world, glittering, enticing, seemingly free, as long as you stay away from politics. And you can travel to the West all you want. You can go to the skiing in the Alps. You can get down to the Amalfi Coast. You can go to whatever. That's the life. If you could make enough money in Russia, you could live a life that was not different from the lives that your compatriots did in Western countries. It's just you had this kind of weird political system. Now we have a new regime of sacrifice, which is kind of exemplified by the picture of the young mobilized soldier saying goodbye to his son before hopping on the train and heading out to the killing fields of Ukraine. The regime is now imposing into your house, your family. It's taking your sons away from you. You're facing economic costs. Your access to all those Western goods and all that stuff is now curtailed, in part because of the sanctions the West have done, and in part because of what has Russia done. So suddenly you are really aware that you are living in a dictatorship, that you are living in an autocracy, that you're living in a world where your closest allies are Syria, North Korea, Eritrea, and Belarus. And you're kind of facing the reality that old live and let live deal is gone. And so these are momentous changes in Russian politics. For now, I think most experts, again, I'm reporting you on what experts say rather than saying that I know for sure. They see the system still stable in the sense that Putin probably does not wake up every morning worrying that there is actually an active coup or that he's going to be thrown out of power tomorrow. That's the sort of what people estimate. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's really hard to know. But these are three momentous changes in this regime, and they're going to have long-standing effects. They're going to create an alienation between the regime and parts of the population. Indeed, hundreds of thousands of them have already left, some of the best and brightest of Russia. So these are all kind of momentous changes to the Russian political system. They don't have an immediate import in terms of generating expectation that we're going to see an end of this war really soon. But they have long-term implications that have to be borne in mind. So with that, I sort of, my concluding slide is the beautiful poppy fields of Ukraine, kind of a hopeful note that the Ukrainian armed forces and society can sustain themselves in this war and can, in some sense, prevail to the satisfaction of their people. And I'll stop the share right now with that kind of, with that update and hope that there's some time left and some inclination left for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was very informative, somewhat depressing, but glad to have this update. I'll get us rolling, and please feel free to either raise your hand, jump in. We're not that big a group, or if you would prefer to write your question in the chat. One of the things that jumped out at me in one of your earlier graphics, Bill, was the where we were looking at the changes in where Russia was exporting now. And I noticed that there was only a 20% change in the US's import of Russian items. And I wondered why it was so low.
Why the decline was so low because we were already essentially not trading anything with Russia.
Oh, okay, that explains.
There's not a lot more to cut out. And I don't know the precise composition of what those are, but some of them have to do with inputs for fertilizer, with other raw materials that go into various industrial processes, and may have, again, I'm speculating now, would defer to experts, but there are also long-term advance contracts on things that are probably being fulfilled. But the big answer is we weren't doing much business with Russia before this.
That makes sense. Thank you. Michael. Here, I'll pop that up.
I'm trying to unmute myself. Sorry. Bill, I think you mentioned that, and I was curious about countries that were listed as sympathetic to Russia. And I thought you said it was because they felt that Russia had legitimate beefs in engaging in this war. Is that right? And what would those, I can't imagine what those would be.
Yeah, I mean, the story that is told on that slide is partly a story of countries that kind of depend on Russia for various things and therefore don't want to alienate Russia, but it's partly a story of how widespread resentment against the West, as it's called, the United States and its chief, rich, powerful allies, how widespread that resentment is. So they tend to say that Russia was ill-treated, that the expansion of NATO in the doorstep of Russia was unacceptable. There's actually a narrative that's sort of a little bit less favorable to Russia in some sense. I mean, if you go to the global south, you talk to somebody in South Africa, or you talk to somebody in Nigeria, you talk to somebody in South America, they'll say, look, America's been a bully all this time. They're invading countries. They're going to make a facile comparison between Iraq 2003, for example, and Ukraine 2022. And they're going to say, well, now Russia's doing the same thing. In some sense, they're not they're not wholehearted rah-rah Russia. However, they're very reluctant to be drawn into or to associate themselves with an unambiguous condemnation of Russia. So you tend to get these two sides. You'll get some of those countries you're referring to did vote for a key UN resolution, which said, this is a violation of the principle of sovereignty. This is not the way to settle disputes. And some voted for that, but at the same time kind of say, I don't like what Russia did, but I sympathize and understand that they did have some legitimate complaints against how they were treated at the hands of NATO and the United States.
I'm going to take a question from the chat, and it's from Tom. Do you think Belarus will enter the war?
Current expert opinion on that is no. For one thing, and again, could be wrong, the Russian troops have been, there's been an increased deployment of Russian troops in Belarus, which is Russia's closest ally on the north to the north of Ukraine. And but the experts whose analyses have so far proven very, very good are dismissive of the probability that Belarus itself would join, and for two reasons. Number one is they have a very low estimate of the military value added of the Belarusian armed forces. And number two, they think it would be potentially, if not fatal, then really dangerous and risky for Alexander Lukashenko, who's the dictator, so-called president, but really the dictator of Belarus. They see those two things as a big kind of disincentive for him to join the war. And we have public evidence of him squirming and doing everything possible to avoid actually committing to the war. Mm-hmm. The current military expert view could be wrong, but again, these experts have tended to be pretty good so far, is that this is a feint, and that Ukraine probably doesn't need to be too worried about a big thrust coming down from the north.
I have a follow-up question to that, which is, do you think that Turkey will remain a reliable Western ally? They seem to be doing a lot
reliable, it's not.
I mean, will it be?
Yeah. About how you define a reliable Western ally. I mean, the country that I'm sitting in today, the United Kingdom, is very, has a view of things. I mean, it's official, but it's not just the official. It's the population, it's the elite. Has a view of the world that's very close to the way many, if not most Americans see things. So it tends to be very much together with the United States on this. So if that's your metric for what a good ally is, then many of them will fall short, because the UK is really on board. They're really mad about what Russia did in Ukraine.
Right.
But Turkey has been under Erdogan, has been playing a game of strategic ambiguity, if you will, kind of cozying up to Russia, strategically making these moves, even as it has also done some things really problematic for Russia, including selling Ukraine very effective weapons. The Bayraktar drones early in the war, you may remember these things, unbelievably effective, killed a lot of Russians with those things. So he's been cagey, but you see on the economic and the trade front, he has been a very useful outlet for Russian exports and has stepped in. In addition, he wants to see himself as an interlocutor between the West and Russia, and so he's put himself forward as a mediator, and did in fact help broker the agreement on the grain exports. So he likes this position. So I would say that he's like, what, 80%, 70% in NATO and 30% playing this game.
Right. Thank you. Anne asks, why is Putin so interested in the Ukraine? Is it for food, oil, mineral resources?
Yeah, so it's really not a economic. I think there are some economic benefits that Russia could conceivably get in the long run through tilting Ukraine towards Russia and keeping it away from the West. So I don't want to suggest that there's no economic benefit to Russia if Ukraine's industry, exports, and economy are more oriented towards Russia. Nor would I rule out the potential influence at the margins of certain key Russian oligarchs or businesses which stand to lose if Ukraine is integrated fully into the European Union. However, I would wager that 95 to 98% of all people who study this thing seriously downgrade the importance of such economic motives when measured against the imperial motive, the idea that that he actually means what he says when he says he believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that he believes what he says when he says that the West is stealing Ukraine out of the Russian world, when he thinks this is all a machination by Western powers, when there is a lot of non-purely material motives. So I think most experts debate essentially how much of it was really about security. Did he really fear NATO expansion, or was that just an excuse? Versus the imperial mindset that he literally wanted as a legacy of his presidency, the decisive inclusion of Ukraine into the Russian ambit or the Russian world, if not territorially, namely just reincorporating chunks of the territory, at the very least making it a subordinate ally of Russia.
Thank you. Any questions from the gallery? I've got more in the chat, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody here. You can unmute and call out. All right. Well, Liz in the chat says, and I imagine you saw this, Bill, last Sunday's New York Times. There was an article making it clear that Trump encouraged Putin in this, just as Putin encouraged Trump. So maybe there is a bigger story even than Putin's narrative that Ukraine really is Russian. The untold story, she says in quotes, the road to war in Ukraine, Trump era politics in the current war. I think that must be the title of the thing, of the article that was on I think it was the New York Times Magazine this past
Yes,
week.
it was a great article. It was a great article because what it does is it provides, and again, there's a lot, just before proceeding, there's a lot of connecting of dots. There's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we can't know. But what that article does, partly simply through an extremely careful reading of the Mueller report, which, as you know, came out a long time ago, but also interviews with some of the key players. What that article shows is that the intervention in 2016 in the US presidential election ultimately became connected to Putin's obsession with Ukraine. It provides a logic to that electoral interference that was not as evident at the time. And there's a timeline going through that. There's a timeline going through that intervention when it becomes evident both here in the U.S. but also in the Kremlin and in the Lubyanka and the KGB or FSB headquarters that, wow, it looks like Trump is actually going to be the nominee, and then whoa, he's actually going to be potentially win this. I mean, it's not, he could win. And at that point, the Russians clearly were pushing for modifications in the U.S. position on Ukraine, particularly weapons sales and sort of how the Republican Party platform treated. We knew these things, but we didn't see how closely they were connected to that intervention. So the main takeaway from my perspective of that story is to provide a much more coherent rationale or storyline or narrative on Russia's intervention in 2019 and how it was already way back then completely connected or strongly connected to his obsession with Ukraine.
Helen asks, what is next after Ukraine if Putin is successful there?
Well, I very much hope that doesn't happen. I actually would say that, again, now I'm saying that here into speculation, trying my best to figure out what's likely to eventuate. I mean, I can't be specific, But it seems to me, as best as barring some dramatic change in the sort of correlation of forces, the military thing, as it unfolds, or a collapse of Western support or something like that, it seems hard for me to see him obtaining such a victory in Ukraine that it would sort of embolden him for further adventures right away. I mean, I think it's going to be a very painful, very costly, very chastening experience for the Russian military, for the Russian society, for the Russian political elite. I don't see them as being particularly eager to take on another country, and definitely not a NATO country, for a long time after this war. That would be my estimate. Now, important to note that it does not mean he's not going to get into a lot more of unconventional sort of subversion operations, meddling intervention. He's likely to do more of it because he's seeing no cost to doing it, because he's basically, his relationship with the West is ruined anyway. So might as well double down on these tactics. So of cyber operations, meddling, interference, subversion, information, disinformation peddling, and the rest of that. So I think you're actually going to see more of these kinds of disrupting operations going forward in the years ahead, rather than necessarily fearing that he's going to go after another country, and certainly not a NATO country.
It's strangely reassuring. In a strange way. So Tara asks, what recommendations would you have for the U.S. State Department?
I think they're doing some good things. Look, I mean, when we're academics, we often spend all our time criticizing everybody. I mean, it's easy sitting here in the Ivy Tower to say, yeah, you should have done this, you should have done that. Monday morning quarterbacking. And I'm not, honestly, this is not a partisan assessment. I generally think that the Biden national security team, to include the U.S. Department of State under Tony Blinken, has been handling this very well. I'm much less inclined to criticize them than I normally am about U.S. foreign policy, because they have walked a very fine line. They really have assembled a huge international coalition in support of Ukraine to try to prevent Russia from obtaining what it would think of as an unambiguous victory here. At the same time, they are very, very astutely aware and acutely aware of the escalation risk, the fear that in a catastrophic collapse in the Russian position could push Putin to escalate even to the use of so-called tactical or small yield nuclear weapons. I think they're handling that really brilliantly now. And I don't, they're under pressure from some quarters on the left of the U.S. political spectrum and the right to sort of pressure Ukraine to make concessions. I personally would not be publicly pressuring Ukraine to make concessions right now. I think that would backfire. But yeah, so at the moment, I think keep up the good work would honestly be my very rare, unusual statement about what literally really is a pretty competent national security team here. You can disagree with them, but I don't think anyone out there questions their basic professionalism, and it's been on display in this particular crisis. That's something I think I am, as a citizen of the United States, I'm a little bit reassured by.
That one's truly reassuring. Thanks. And let's see, from Lynn, can you envision an outcome of Ukraine succeeding in resisting Russia's war on them and Ukraine feeling secure going forward?
I actually can envision that. I don't know if I can envision them reconquering. I can envision it, but I don't see as likely the capacity of Ukraine to reconquer, to retake, bring back into its sovereign control all of the territory that Russia has stolen from them, in particular, Crimea. That would be a very, very hard nut to crack. Just militarily would be a very hard nut to crack. And so, however, I both hope, but also actually believe that Ukraine will be able to establish a position in terms of territorial control that will allow it to be a successful, flourishing, independent sovereign state and defend it against further Russian coercion going forward. So I think that's possible, but it won't be easy because I believe, and that's why I don't think the Biden administration should be pressuring Ukraine into concessions right now. I believe that if you go back to those maps, I'm not going to put them back on, that territory along the Black Sea where you see there Kherson, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, these are incredibly valuable territories. They are on the Black Sea. They are part of the outflow. That's like their Mississippi River, the Dnieper coming out there. And just to put that in Russian hands and have them literally within a rocket fire of
Just
Odessa
moved it and plugged in.
Oops.
is that is not sustainable, or at least very damaging to Ukraine's future. So I think Ukraine can establish a position that would allow it to be a secure and independent state, even though I don't know, but it's possible that it won't get all of the land back.
Right. Kathy, did you have a question?
No, I do have a question.
Sure.
What's happened to all the people that when they took over territory in the East, to the people that they forcibly moved out of Ukraine and into Russia and scattered them all over, including Siberia?
Well,
did those people go willingly or not?
we don't have a precise tally of how many went willingly and how many went in, how many were coerced or felt impelled or compelled to go and felt they had no other option. We don't know the numbers, and I don't know how we could know those numbers. We have a lot, however, a lot of reliable information, carefully curated from social media that shows that we know a heck of a lot of them did not want to go to Russia and do not want to be in Russia and want to be rejoined with their families. The precise proportion we do not know, but we know it's substantial. And so that's basically all I can say on that subject. It's very, 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 very tragic. I can tell you, as somebody who's studying these things, I mean, I know many people who within their own families who are Russians, who also have Ukrainian relatives. And so we have a family literally as close as husband and wife, cousin, nephew, uncle, grandpa, grandson, that kind of family. I'm talking an actual family where it's not just we're claiming it. Ukrainians are, real families who span these borders where they literally cannot communicate. Where literally the Russian side of the family is saying this is all, your fault. This is you're bombing yourself. The Russians are not violating any human right. I mean, it's really tragic human stories of families ripped apart by this war, and then layered onto that of the stories of these Ukrainians who are now in the hands of Russia, can't get back home, and they're missing their loved ones. And it's just another one of the tragedies of this war.
Well, we're getting close to 1 o'clock. I have a final question for you. We haven't talked about him very much, but how's Zelensky doing, in your opinion?
Zelensky is look, when Zelensky before the invasion of so I don't know if anybody on this show, I highly recommend it if you have Netflix, has watched
Watched it.
Servant of the People. Love the show, although it's somewhat heartbreaking to see these beautiful pictures of Ukraine and now know that it's pockmarked like London after the Blitz. But he was a comedic actor who before this invasion had an approval rating of 20%. I mean, he was not popular, and then he became a hero and a leader and rose to the occasion. There's the man or the person, there's a human, and there's the circumstances. They came together for Zelensky to make him into a remarkable leader. Now there are those in the West who are sort of, I'm getting tired of Zelensky, coming and asking us for weapons, and I'm tired of that. He doesn't just come. He should just come here and thank us. He should just come here and thank us. I think most people understand that if they were in his situation, they'd be pretty kind of demanding too, trying to save their country. So I think he's holding up well, very well, as a wartime leader. If you're measured by your success in the war, Ukraine has had remarkable success beyond what anybody expected back in March when I first came here. And so Zelensky either helped make that happen or didn't prevent it from happening. And by Jove, that's not bad leadership right there. So something to applaud in my view.
Thanks. And yes, it is a completely surreal experience to watch the Netflix sitcom with Zelensky.
Yeah.
But I
It's
recommend
incredible.
it as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much, Bill. I hope that we answered most of your questions here in the audience. I hope we won't need to check in again on this topic, but we welcome you here to the library when you're back in town, and look forward to continuing to learn from you. The time that you have taken to explain these really complex issues to us is much appreciated.
Well,
So-
thank you very much. And I hope there will be some occasion to have something to talk about that's a little less sad.
Yes, me too. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, folks.